All right, it's finally time to run the application. Again, I have an ordering model, I have a home controller with some action methods, and I have some views for those action methods. So we're starting to get a decently featured application that interacts with Entity Framework, which then manages the interactions with the database. All right, so I'll go ahead and run this, and assuming I've done everything right, we should get a list of customers. Okay, so it's a good sign that the index view displayed. So here is the list of customers. Of course, there's no customers yet because we just started the application, just created the database. This is the first time I'm running the application, and it was a little slow getting started because it had to do an awful lot of work. Connect to SQL Server, create the database, create all the database objects that I've defined, and so forth. And then open up the view, read, hit the database, get a collection of customers. Again, there aren't any, but it has to execute that query to find that out. And then renders this view, taking that data from the database with the HTML that I defined within the index view, and gives us this basic view. And again, this is the empty template. So you can see it has a little bit of styling, but it's the empty template for an MVC application. All right, and I have this link called Create New. I'll go ahead and click on that. And that loads my empty Create view. So now it's ready to start accepting data from the user. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my own data here. Don Kiley. Company is LearnNow. Bogus email address. Don't try to email me there. Phone is 800-578-2062. And I'm entering all these other fields. None of them are required because I haven't marked them as required, but created is required. It's a date time type, and so it is required. So I'm going to enter 12/20/2015. Okay? All right, so there's all of the data. So I'm going to click on the button here, and recall that what happens is that when I click the button, it executes the post form of the create method, takes that customer object or instantiates a customer object, takes all of the form collection fields from this form, populates the properties of that customer object, and then uses the add method of the customer's collection in order to add it to the collection in memory, and then call the save changes on the database. So I'll click on Create, and there we have it. Went out, redisplayed the index view, hit the database again to get all of the records back. There's only one, but shows that we've now successfully created an application, has a database, there's some place to store the data, and we've successfully read it back. So always a relief that I've done everything right so far, at least it seems so. Pretty basic application, but it's functional. And so Entity Framework and MVC work together to provide the various features in the infrastructure to make all this happen. I haven't written any database code. I created a connection string because I wanted to put it in a non-standard location, but I haven't written any code to actually read and write the data. It's all being handled by Entity Framework. Okay, so I'm going to end the application. The first thing I want to do is come over here to Solution Explorer. I'm going to refresh the set of files and show all files. So notice that I don't have anything in app data. There's no little arrow there that I can expand. Had I not changed the default location of the database, had I just left it alone, this app data folder would have an ordering.models.ordering context database, that name .mdf, here within this folder. It would be either a SQL Express or a local DB database. Okay. Now, I didn't do that because I don't have SQL Express installed in this machine, and Visual Studio 2013 has an inconsistency because it has the SQL Server 2012 version of LocalDB installed, but I have SQL Server 2014 installed. So I have this disconnect. So I redirected over here within the web.config file. I redirected it to use the database over here, the local host, which is the default instance of SQL Server 2014. So let's go take a look at that and see what we ended up with. All right, using a local instance, I'll actually change that to localhost and connect to it. Drill down here. So you can see I have a bunch of sample files, and I have ordering.models.ordering_context. So this is that new database that I just created by virtue of running the application. I didn't come over here to Management Studio, didn't create it, didn't do anything manually at all. All right, so if I expand it, you can look at the tables. And as you can see, I have addresses, I'll talk about that one in just a second, customers, and orders. So those are the three tables that I have that I defined within the model within my application. And if I look at the columns within each of these, you can see that I have a customer ID, or first name, last name, company, email, phone, and created date. What's interesting here is that all of the strings are in varchar maxes. Way overkill for a first name to be able to take 2 gigabytes basically of data for a first name. Definitely overkill. But I'm accepting the defaults because I didn't tell Code First to do anything different. Okay, that's something that we can affect by our model design, but I didn't do any of that stuff yet. Okay, if we look at addresses, which is the collection of address objects, you can see they have the address ID that I defined, street, city, state, province, postal code. Again, just to make the point, if I come back over here to ordering models, you can look at customer here, and we have all of those fields. Okay. Now we don't have those fields because those are navigation properties. These are being used by Code First within the code. And there's the address fields and the order fields. When I come back over here, that corresponds there to those fields within those tables, and then there are those same fields. Now, I did get customer ID and address ID, but that's because I explicitly included those here because I didn't want the long name of customer_customer ID or address_address ID. I wanted to control the name, and there's various other ways of doing that as well. And I also wanted these values to be accessible from within my code. For whatever reason, I wanted access to them within my application. It's not necessary to do that for Code First to work with Entity Framework. All right, now, another interesting thing happened. I also got a fourth table. Well, hang on a second. I didn't define a table called customer addresses. I defined a table called customer, called address, and order. And ordering context, but this doesn't become a table within the database. So what's this customer addresses? Well, what this is that this is a many-to-many table. This was created automatically because I created a many-to-many relationship between the customer and address classes. Coming back over here, I did that because I have a many relationship to addresses, and in address I have a many relationship to customers, a many-to-many relationship. So this is how, by default, Entity Framework materializes that data. It has to put that many-to-many data someplace, and all it consists of is the foreign keys into those two related tables. And as you can see here, the names of those fields are customer, customer ID, and address, address ID. All right, so that's the purpose of that. I don't end up with a customer addresses object within my model that I'm going to use within code. Instead, I'm going to use the customer object and the addresses navigation property in order to navigate to addresses and vice versa from address to customer. Okay? But this is how the database manages it. Now, I could change this, define my own customer addresses, include those foreign keys, and include other information. For example, for a customer addresses many-to-many table, I might want to identify what kind of address this is. Home address, work address, postal address, whatever kind of address it is. So I can do that, in which case then I would want to materialize the entity within an entity framework so that I can access that data. But absent that, I don't need to work with a customer addresses entity. Okay, so that's it. I now have a functioning application, albeit not yet a full-featured one, with a complete database behind it. Entity Framework inferred a lot of information from the model classes. And in particular, it looked at the data types as well. I specified a string. There's a lot of different ways of representing strings in a SQL Server database table for field, but it selected the default of varchar max. Okay, another thing it did, back to relationships, is that it saw that I had a one-to-many relationship between the orders and customer table. And so because I specified those fields, it included those two foreign keys explicitly. But otherwise, it also defined the different relationships based on the navigation properties. Okay, another thing I can do is I can look at customers. Oh, and by the way, it pluralized the name of the tables. You can turn that off, but that's the default behavior of code first. So I can go in here and open up the design window, and we can explore this a little bit more. So you see the customer ID. If I scroll down here, you can see that because it saw that it's a primary key and an integer, it created it as an identity specification and set the identity increment to 1 and the identity seed to 1. And you can see it made it the primary key as well. It saw that I had a field that was of the form class name with ID, and so it identified that as the primary key of the table. Okay, so it inferred that information as well. Now, if I had included a field here, not called it customer ID, but client ID or company ID, now it breaks that convention, and I would explicitly have to mark that as a primary key. So that's another way that you can customize the model. And so it did that for the other tables as well, address ID and order ID. I stuck with convention, and so I identified those as primary keys. All right, let me click on this relationship button there, and this shows the relationships that were defined for this table. So as you can see, there's two of them, customer addresses to customers and orders to customers. And so for this one, customer addresses, you can see that if I expand this section, it's relating customer addresses to customers. So this is part of that many-to-many relationship. And then I can select that one and see that this one is between orders and customers. So again, because I included those navigation properties in my model, these properties right here, it was able to infer the relationships and set it up as valid relationships. All right, and then the one last thing that I want to point out is here in the orders table, I defined total order as a decimal, and code first and or SQL Server colluded in order to set a default type, decimal 1812. So that's the default for a .NET decimal type. Okay, so it did a lot of work, inferred a lot of information from my really pretty simple classes.